New York was dead. Not figuratively, it was frozen solid. The worst storm in decades had turned Manhattan into a glass maze, and the snowdrifts were waist-deep. John sat in the back of a police cruiser that crawled along the icy avenue, feeling his blue and white raglan sweatshirt, with detective and sailor bears, absorb the cold of the world around him. An old, damp trench coat was thrown over it. "Here we are, Captain," muttered the driver, a uniformed policeman cursing his fate. "Wayland Tower. Even hell isn't this clean." The skyscraper towered over the snow-covered streets like a black tombstone. Due to a power outage, it was completely dark, with only emergency generators lighting the lobby. John got out, and the cold air burned his lungs. The victim, Aaron Wayland, lay on the carpet in his penthouse on the 30th floor. His security guard, pale with shock, took John upstairs in a small service lift running on backup power. John surveyed the room. The panoramic windows were covered with snow, the double electronic doors were tightly closed. No signs of a struggle, no broken glass. Wayland had died from a single blow to the head with a blunt object. Nearby, on a glass table, lay a mobile phone, its screen frozen on the number 11:47 p.m. The time of death. "The lock, detective," said the guard. "No one could have gotten in. It's a sealed safe. Only those three. They were in the security room when the power went out." John crouched down beside the body, his ice-blue eyes scanning the room intently. He ran his finger over the thin layer of dust on the edge of the windowsill. "The perfect crime," John muttered. "I love it." The security room on the first floor was the only place where it was relatively warm. The three suspects sat on metal chairs, their expensive suits looking out of place in the dim, reddish light of the emergency lamps. John sat down opposite them, placing his notebook on the table. He still smelled of wet snow. "Let's go over this again, very briefly," John began, his gaze sweeping across each face. "The lights went out at 11:30 p.m. Mr. Wayland died at 11:47 p.m. What were the three of you doing during that time?" Jessica Page, around 40, cold as steel, perfect hairstyle despite the storm, answered first, her voice steady as if she were reading a report. "We were here. All together. Waiting for the generators to kick in. We were discussing a plan of action in case of a prolonged outage. Marcus and Robert will confirm that." Marcus Stone, CFO, around 50, nervous, aggressive, quickly chimed in. "That's right. We didn't leave. I begged Robert to get those damn lifts working. Jessica didn't leave the phone. We were here." Robert Lee, CTO, 30, glasses, depressed, with a head full of technical terms, nodded. It was physically impossible to get to the 30th floor without an elevator in such weather conditions. The emergency stairs require access codes that only work on the main power supply. "We were here." "Perfect. 3 witnesses, 3 alibis, 0 time for murder." John leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on Robert. "You created the security system, Robert. Isn't that right?" "Yes," he replied quietly. "So you're the only one who knew how." "Perfect. 3 witnesses, 3 alibis, 0 time for murder." John leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on Robert. "You created the security system, Robert. Isn't that right?" "Yes," he replied quietly. "So you're the only one who knew how not to create it." John stood up. His blue and white sweatshirt stood out against the dark, cold room. "You all have motives. You all have alibis. You're all lying. Now the only question is which one of you used the snowstorm to get free, and how. I'll be back. Until then, no one leaves this building." The snowstorm had subsided, but the city was still coming to its senses. John, still wearing his sweatshirt and trench coat, sat in the temporary headquarters they had set up in one of the conference rooms at Wayland Tower. Printed financial reports lay before him, while his partner, Detective Miller, leafed through the victim's personal correspondence. "Here's what we have, Captain," Miller said, handing John a folder. "Aaron Wayland was king. But his throne was built on sand. Tomorrow at 9 a.m., he was scheduled to meet with the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC. They knew about the fraud, and he was going to turn them all in, Marcus, Jessica, and even Robert as accomplices." John nodded, his eyes focused on the penthouse floor plan. So the killer had a clear deadline: before dawn. When the light returns, the game is over. The motives of all three are crystal clear. John sorted through the photos of the suspects. Jessica Page, Wayland not only dumped her, but also had evidence that she used insider information. Marcus Stone, his reputation, freedom, and entire life were about to go down the drain if Wayland named him as the sole culprit. Robert Lee, Wayland had essentially stolen his safety patents, paying him peanuts. Robert lost everything he had created. All three had motives worth millions of dollars and years in prison, Miller concluded. But they all sat in the same room like three angels. None of them moved. No, John objected, putting down the diagram. There was movement. Not physical, but logical. Wayland was killed in a locked room from the inside, and his killer was in a locked room below. The answer isn't how he got out. It's what he used to cover the distance. Miller, go back to the penthouse. Look for something that shouldn't be there. I'll go to Robert Lee. He's the weak link. He knows too much about the systems. Detective Miller was alone in the penthouse. The light from the emergency generators was dim and cast strange shadows, which only added to the feeling of claustrophobia. The forensic teams had left, but John had instructed him to look for something that broke the rules. Miller started with what interested the forensic team the least: the ventilation system. According to Robert Lee, it was completely closed and not subject to external control. Miller removed the decorative grill from one of the vents closest to the body. It was clean inside, but he shone his torch upwards, into the shaft. There, deep inside the steel grill, he saw it, a thin, almost invisible synthetic thread similar to fishing line. It was securely clamped between two bars. Miller carefully pulled it out with tweezers. The thread was not only abnormally strong, but also had a barely noticeable, sticky, oily residue. He looked back at Wayland's body. Blunt force trauma. No weapon was found in the penthouse. Miller went out into the corridor, where mobile reception was only available near the emergency window, and called John. "Captain, you were right. The alibi is broken. It wasn't direct contact. I found something in the ventilation. A thread. Very strong. And you know what? It has a faint smell of ozone and what looks like frozen gel." John was silent on the other end, but his mind was already working at full speed. The killer didn't come in, Miller. He lowered the murder weapon. And he used the cold to pull it back up. It took someone who not only had access to the ventilation shafts, but also knew the exact composition of the air in them. Robert Lee. Now the game begins. Jessica Page sat in the interrogation room, her face as cold and flawless as before. But this time, John felt a slight tremor in her hands as she raised the coffee cup to her lips. On the table lay the burnt end of the thin synthetic thread Miller had found. "Miss Page," John began, his voice calm but cutting like a frosty wind. "You said you were in the security room with Marcus and Robert the whole time." "Yes." Her voice was so even that it sounded mechanical. "Aaron Wayland was going to turn you in tomorrow morning, wasn't he? For insider trading. He was also going to expose your affair to discredit you." Jessica clenched her jaw, her gaze becoming even sharper. "That's not true. He would never." "He would. And you know it. He had evidence against you, Mrs. Page. Evidence he kept in his safe. If his report had gone to the SC, your life would have been ruined." Jessica stared at him, her eyes beginning to fill with tears, but she still held her ground. She remembered how Wayland had threatened her, how he had called her his little doggy, who did everything he said. She remembered how he had forced her to do terrible things. She remembered how he had promised her a surprise that would destroy her. John carefully pushed the thread closer to her. "We found this in the ventilation shaft, Mrs. Page. It was used to deliver something." Jessica broke down. Tears streamed down her face, smearing her perfect makeup. Fine. I lied. I lied about not leaving the phone. I left for a few minutes to call my sister. I was desperate. But I didn't kill anyone. I didn't put anything down the vent. I just wanted him to stop." She confessed to a minor lie, but her alibi for the murder was still intact. She didn't know how Wayland had been killed. She knew she wasn't responsible for what had happened. She just wanted him to stop. John nodded, his face remaining impassive. He got what he wanted. A partial destruction of the alibi that creates more questions than answers. Marcus Stone, the financial director, looked exhausted. His expensive suit was rumpled, and his aggressive self-confidence had vanished. John, still in his sweatshirt and trench coat, sat opposite him, studying him as if he were a mere accounting error. Marcus, John began, his voice calm. We know that Aaron Wayland was going to pin the entire financial pyramid on you. His plan was simple: you're the scapegoat, he's clean. That's a lie. Marcus shouted, pounding his fist on the table. He was a scumbag, but I didn't kill him. But you had the biggest and most compelling motive, John insisted. You were losing not only money, but years of freedom. Now imagine, Jessica steps out for a minute to make a phone call. Robert is busy trying to get the system up and running. You have 17 minutes of clear time and 1 minute when your two witnesses are distracted. John leaned forward, pointing to the mysterious thread on the table. You were closest to the door. We know you had a duplicate mechanical key to the emergency staircase. I didn't go up the stairs. That's crazy. They're covered in snow. Yes, John agreed. Insane. But you didn't use the stairs. You used the chaos. You knew that 11:47 p.m. was the time of death. That's only 17 minutes. You could have used that minute of distraction to launch a plan that lasted 17 minutes. Marcus began to tremble. He understood that John wasn't asking if he had killed, but how. Do you know why I couldn't do it? Marcus lowered his head. I'm too old-fashioned. If I were going to kill him, I would have used a gun. Not this physical trick with some string. This is Robert's work. He's a psychopath obsessed with his technology. John stood up. He had another revelation. Marcus had confirmed his motive and his desperation, but his rejection of the string trick sounded genuine. The killer was not someone who acted impulsively. The killer was a cold genius. Robert Lee sat across from John, his glasses reflecting the dim light of the lamp. Unlike Marcus, he was not aggressive, but eerily calm. Robert, you're a genius, John began, unbuttoning his trench coat to reveal the beer's logo on his sweatshirt. You created a system that no one could hack. And you were the only one who knew how to use it. My system works flawlessly, Detective, Robert replied, without taking his eyes off John. I wouldn't compromise it. John carefully placed a small sealed bag on the table. Inside was a thin synthetic thread. We found this in the penthouse ventilation shaft. It has traces of frozen gel and ozone. As the creator, you have the keys to all the ventilation and cooling systems. You knew the exact schematics. John leaned forward, his voice lowering to a dangerous whisper. When the lights went out, you knew no one would come up. In the moment Jessica was distracted, you activated the ventilation in reverse mode, using the backup power to create a small draft. You lowered the murder weapon, something heavy, like a lead tip wrapped in frozen gel or ice that leaves no fingerprints, on that thread straight into the penthouse. 2347. You struck and instantly pulled the weapon back up the shaft. The storm and snow covered any outside sounds. Robert's face remained unchanged. He listened intently, as if it were an interesting technical lecture. You claim that I used the climate control system to commit a yo-yo murder. That's right, John confirmed. You created the perfect alibi by using your two other partners as your bodyguards, and the perfect crime by using your own technology. How could you have killed him? With brass knuckles hidden in the ventilation filter? Or with a special ice ball that would melt when exposed to heat? Robert ran his hand over his beard. A faint smile appeared on his face, not a laugh, but intellectual satisfaction. Detective, that's a brilliant reconstruction. You've perfectly described how it could have been done if someone had intended to do it. But you have no evidence that I did it. No fingerprints. No weapon. No confession. Robert had won this round. John had the means and the motive, but he had no hard evidence. The game had entered a new, more dangerous phase. It was late at night. John's temporary office was silent, broken only by the crackling of an old lamp. Outside the window, the snow-covered roofs of New York began to come to life, catching the first rays of morning light. John was alone, with a ventilation diagram and blood-stained photos from the penthouse spread out in front of him. 23:30, lights out. 23:47, death. 17 minutes, John whispered, his gaze fixed on those numbers. He adjusted his trench coat again and felt the cold seeping through his sweatshirt. He knew Robert Lee couldn't have held the thread in the ventilation system, lowered it, hit it, and pulled it up instantly while he was arguing with Marcus. That would have been physically careless, and Robert was obsessed with perfect precision. John returned to the idea of time. Why 17 minutes? Not 5. Not 30. He remembered the snowstorm and the temperature. The killer used not just the lack of light, but nature, he muttered. He took a sheet of paper and began to draw. $T understood. /right euro dollar. Outside temperature. $/euro. Ventilation temperature. John understood. 17 minutes was the time needed for synchronization. During those 17 minutes, when the lights went out and the penthouse's heating systems switched to slow backup power, the temperature inside the room dropped sharply. At the same time, the snowstorm battering the windows reached its peak intensity. It wasn't just murder, it was an engineering project. Robert had hidden not just a spool of thread in the ventilation shaft beforehand, but a compact, automatic mechanism. He programmed it for a 17-minute delay after the main power was cut off. It gave him time to create an ironclad alibi with Marcus and Jessica. It gave the cold time to turn any ice or gel component of the weapon into a perfectly solid, cold weapon. The peak intensity of the storm at the 17th minute ensured that any noise from the mechanism or impact would be drowned out by the wind. John felt it. It was an intellectual triumph. Robert wasn't just a killer, he was a clockmaker of death. His alibi was broken not by his escape, but by the precision of his plan. Morning had arrived. The light from the sun, which had peeked out after the storm, was dazzlingly white, but the atmosphere in John's office was cold. Miller returned from the forensics department, holding printouts in his hands. John, who now looked fresher but was still wearing his crumpled trench coat, was waiting. "So, Miller, what does the weather say and what does the indoor climate say?" John asked. "You were right about the 17 minutes, Captain." Forensic scientists retrieved data from the backup thermal sensor. At exactly 11:47 p.m., the temperature in the penthouse dropped to a critical point. It was the perfect humidity for any object made of ice or gel to become as hard as possible. Miller placed a graph in front of John. "And here's the data from the weather station. At 23:47, the external wind pressure was at its peak, creating the loudest noise that could drown out any technical sound inside the building. It was the killer's noise curtain." John nodded, his gaze sliding over the charts. This wasn't just murder, it was engineering symmetry. Robert Lee didn't just kill, he created a masterpiece of perfect planning. He didn't just use the storm. He synchronized with it, John said. This proves premeditation, prior intent. Before the storm, he installed a device in the ventilation shaft that was triggered by a timer linked to the power outage. A device that used a thread to lower and pull up the weapon. He didn't leave us the weapon, but he left us the algorithm. Miller was impressed. "But that's not enough for the court, Captain. We don't have the device." "We won't look for the device," John replied, standing up and buttoning his trench coat over his favorite sweatshirt. "We'll look for pride. Robert Lee won't admit guilt until he realizes that we appreciate the genius of his plan. He believes he has created a perfect, unbreakable circle. We'll show him that this circle has one single, perfectly calculated flaw. The final meeting. The time has come." John gathered the three suspects in a spacious but cold room on the top floor of the police station. The snow had melted, and outside the window was the gray, gloomy sky of New York City. Jessica, Marcus, and Robert sat at a long table. John stood leaning against the table. His blue and white hoodie with bears on it looked bold against the seriousness of the moment. This wasn't a robbery. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was an engineered murder, John began, his voice as calm as ice. "And all three of you were part of it." He placed a thin thread and a graph showing the peak wind and temperature drop on the table. Jessica, you lied about not leaving to hide your affair. Marcus, you lied to hide that you were going to run away from financial ruin. Your little lies created the perfect alibi, where you were all supposedly watching each other. But in reality, you two were just puppets distracting attention. Jessica and Marcus began to protest, but John didn't let them speak. He looked directly at Robert Lee. Robert, you did not enter the room, did not climb the stairs, and did not leave the security room. You were where you said you were. But you committed the crime. You were the only one who knew that the automatic coil hidden in the ventilation shaft would activate at the 17th minute of the blackout, when the snowstorm would reach its peak and the temperature in the penthouse would be ideal for a frozen weapon. Robert sat motionless. Jessica and Marcus looked at him in horror, realizing the horror and genius of the plan. You didn't kill him the moment the lights went out. You killed him when the circumstances were perfectly symmetrical. 2347, John emphasized, his words like a gunshot. Robert, you didn't just want him to die. You wanted his death to be technically perfect. You wanted the world to understand that your technology is the most advanced, even in murder. Robert slowly raised his gaze. There was no fear on his face, only sad, almost contemptuous pride. He remained silent. John knew that his logical trap had worked. Jessica and Marcus were let out, their shocked faces showing their relief at being cleared of suspicion, but not of their fate. Only John and Robert Lee remained in the room. The silence was so loud that you could hear water dripping somewhere. You have all the details, detective. But you don't understand the most important thing, Robert said quietly. John sat down, resting his hands on the table. His gaze was warm, almost sympathetic, despite his white and blue sweatshirt and outward severity. I don't understand why you took such a risk, Robert. You could have just sold your patent to someone else. Why such a complicated, risky, and perfectly calculated crime? It's not about patents. It's about contempt. Robert's eyes flashed with real pain for the first time. Wayland used my intellect as his slave labor. He called me his little calculator. He didn't just steal my work, he made me believe that my genius was worthless unless it served him. I created perfect systems, and he called them expensive toys. Robert leaned forward, his voice turning into a proud but broken whisper. I wanted him to die from what he thought was impossible. I wanted my technology to be perfect, even in murder. My crime proved that I was the master, and he was just a stupid user. John nodded. It was the final piece of the puzzle. And you knew that the weapon that delivered the fatal blow would never be found. Exactly, Robert finally allowed himself to smile. That smile was an admission. I used a specially synthesized, frozen hydrogel. It can withstand impact, but after the thread is pulled, it turns into ordinary, rapidly evaporating moisture in a minute. Perfect. I left only the algorithm and the thread to see if there was anyone in this city who could understand my work. He looked at John with respect. You are the only one. You understood the symmetry. John stood up. He felt no triumph, only fatigue. I understand, Robert. And now you will pay for it. The case was closed. John left the police station and stepped out onto the street, where the sun was already shining brightly. The ice alibi had melted away, leaving behind only the bitter truth about human arrogance. He adjusted his trench coat, under which he was wearing a sweatshirt with teddy bears on it. The hunt was over. It was time to move on.